Perfect. We are now live. Hi everyone tuning in to ProductTank Birmingham to celebrate World Product Day here with us. What we'll do is we're just going to wait a minute or so just for folks to join as they're jumping in. But what we wanted to do was sort of have all of the co-organisers on to say a quick hi to everyone before we kind of kick off with this evening. Awesome. Cool. We have KG and Janice with us today, so co-organising and speaker Dave as well. So just kind of saying hi to everyone as you're all jumping into the call today.
Hi everybody. Happy World Product Day.
Awesome. Cool.
Janice is she's
Hi everybody.
Oh, there you go. I was just about to say you were having some technical difficulties, but you're back.
As we're going through, feel free to say hi in the comments, post any questions in, or have any chat in there. Unfortunately, we're not face to face, but please do feel free to sort of carry on the conversation in those comments as it comes through. Janice has turned into a spinning circle for me, and Janice is now gone. Okay, so it was nice to see Janice. Awesome, cool. So you can kind of see some folks coming in here. So what I might do is jump to share my screen.
Okay, I'm going to drop out. Enjoy the talk, everyone, and happy World Product Day.
Awesome. Thanks for joining, KG. Great. Cool. So thanks everyone for joining today and helping us celebrate World Product Day. So as you might have seen some of the sort of social media posts going around today, World Product Day we celebrate once a year, and we have a number of different product tanks all across the world that take place on a single day. So what's great is that it kind of kicked off at midnight earlier today over in New Zealand, and that's going to go through all the way to 1 a.m. tomorrow morning, finishing off in Portland. So sort of over 50 different events taking place. And what's great, the kind of silver lining of us all being remote, is they are all being streamed on the YouTube channel as well. So if you do fancy checking out any other talks that are going on today, feel free to check out the Minor Products YouTube channel that you're watching the stream on today. Cool. So 10 years ago, product looked pretty lonely, and the creators of ProductTank sort of met together in a pub, sort of exchanging stories, experiences, product problems and woes, and kind of from there developed ProductTank. And ProductTank started in London 10 years ago, and it's now spread to be sort of global all across the world, as we mentioned, how many events are going on just today. And ProductTank was born out of, and then Minor Product was born out of ProductTank as well, which some of you may be aware of. You know, they've got tons and tons of great content online, which we'll jump to, but also just events all over the world that are growing ever more so with the Engage events too. So 10 years later, product looks a little bit less lonely now. There's actually product tanks in over 200 different cities. So what's great about being part of the ProductTank network is if you're ever in another city, you can just look up, are there any other product tanks going on? And you can jump along and, you know, meet with other product people across the globe. As part of that, as I mentioned, you know, we've got minorproduct.com, where there's lots and lots of great content that's being posted out, lots of blog posts, recording of talks as well, from their conferences too. There's also a jobs board if you are looking for any jobs in product, and there's training available too. And worth mentioning here, Minor Product have just launched a membership scheme, which gives you even more access to more content, and also gives you access to product experts too. So this really is your community. ProductTank is by product people and it's for product people. And we're always looking for more stories. So if you do want to speak at an event that we're running, and we're looking for sponsors as well, if you do want to host, please do feel free to get in touch, as this is really community run. So today is the 10th anniversary of ProductTank, and so it's a sort of extra special World Product Day as well. As mentioned, there's 50 live different events going on throughout the day. And if you do want to see a list of all those different events going on, you can head to worldproductday.com. So just wanted to say a quick thank you to our sponsors. Unfortunately, we're not being hosted by one of our sponsors in their offices this month, but just a special thanks to Talis, Kanos and VoxBotMe for their continued support. And we look forward to being back in your offices and enjoying your pizza and beers. So tonight's event, what we're going to do, we've had the introduction, so we're through that. So I'll be able to hand over to Dave for his talk, which is going to run for sort of 40 to 50 minutes. As you've seen, there's comments on the right-hand side. As you're going through, please do feel free to add any comments into the live chat stream there. Dave will be fielding comments throughout the talk, so I'll be interjecting with any questions that you do have. And please do feel free to ask anything as you go through. There will be some time for Q&A at the end if there is anything that crops up at the end of the talk as well. But yeah, please do feel free to really engage with the talk this evening. Awesome. So our speaker this evening is Dave Martin. And so Dave Martin is founder of Right to Left, which is a product training firm that's helped teams to put customers at the heart of decisions. Dave has some really fantastic connections to Birmingham, so it's a bit of a shame that he's not live with us in Birmingham this evening, including an uncle who was a former Birmingham FC captain in the 70s, and also connections to Jeff Lynn from ELO. So some absolutely huge names in there from Birmingham. So I'll let you speak more to those as we go through. But yeah, without further ado, Dave, I'll hand over to you and get your screen up on the screen.
Great. Thanks ever so much for that introduction. I think I'll save adding more flavour to my Birmingham connections for the next time you run an event, and I'll come and join it when it's physical and we can have a beer and have those discussions.
Perfect.
Hopefully everyone's sitting comfortably, and you know, if you're in the evening in the UK, then hopefully you've got a beer or a glass of wine. And I'll do my best to make this enjoyable and entertaining. If you've got any questions, as just mentioned, please just interrupt and let me know. Let's take them as they come rather than at the end, because there's quite a lot of content and I prefer we talk about it when we're in the right context. Here's the mandatory slide that says stuff about me, so we'll skip that one. Let's go straight into a discussion around what is growth, because this discussion is all about the product growth engine, and it feels like we really ought to identify what we mean by the word growth first. Now it's going to be a little hard over the webinar rather than in a room, but let's have a go and see what happens. What could go wrong? I'm going to ask you guys in the chat window just to put in what you think what growth means to you. What does it mean to you in your companies? What do you feel growth means? And hopefully you'll say some things. Somebody at least will, and you can we can read a few out, and then we can talk about that. Is anyone participating?
Awesome. Not yet. Hopefully we'll have someone come through on here. I'm sure everyone is frantically typing.
Well, while we wait, why don't you answer the question? What does growth mean to you?
So growth means to me, I guess in terms of growth in the product, I would think more monthly active users is something that we care about. Growth within recurring revenue, and number of customers. So we have we sell business to business, so it's growing number of customers and then number of users within that customer base as well.
Cool. So MAUs, RPUs, average revenue per user, or maybe monthly active users, that kind of number. Great. So adoption and revenue, basically, people using the product and adoption, and people paying for it. Did anybody put anything in the chat window?
Not yet. Oh,
no,
here we go. Oh, yeah, we had a bunch coming at a time. Okay, great.
Fantastic.
Cool. So first one from KG, at the moment for us, it is growing to new markets.
Oh, cool. New markets.
From Andy, we've got getting bigger. Dave is increased turnover. From Nilu, we've got it is getting new users and keep the users with us and more $. From David, we've got revenue, usage, and higher NPS. And then from Sam, growth, ways to achieve product market fit to satisfy retention, to such a point that satisfied sticky users generate more users through referral and recommendation. And finally, we've had Keith, growth in knowledge to make your teams and businesses' next steps more effective.
Fantastic. Thank you, all of you, for joining in. It's good to try and hear the audience rather than it being me talking to myself in an empty room. That's awesome. So overall, there was pretty much the same area. Growth is growing the business, i.e. revenue and profit. And you all have different ways of measuring it because your products are all different and your markets are all different. B2B will think differently to B2C. A revenue model that's transactional is going to think differently to a revenue model that's subscription. And one really interesting one in there was NPS. And I've worked with some companies who are, crazily growing, but aren't thinking about revenue at all at that particular early stage in their startup. And it's all about user growth, and NPS is really important to them. So it's really the point I wanted to make there is that we all measure growth very differently. The nuances are different, but at the end of the day, it's obviously about creating future profitability of some sort. And depending on what stage we're at, depends how much we focus on the profit immediately versus versus established or startup companies. And it's important that we agree and understand that growth is about growing the revenue and the profitability, so that we can talk about the rest of the evening. And if we think about what makes a company grow, I feel pretty strongly that high growth companies in tech, high growth tech companies, they innovate their way to success. And that's really, that statement is slightly different depending on the type of business. But in the tech world, the word innovate is really critical. And I think too often this type of thing is this kind of statement's a little cliche, and I'm sorry for that. But I think too often we hear the word innovate and perhaps we run away from it. It makes us think, depends where we work, but it makes us think about huge disruptive innovation. It makes us think about Uber disrupting the taxi industry. It makes us think about things that have completely changed our way of living or the way we operate, or an industry or a sector. And whilst that obviously is innovation, and obviously those companies are successful, there is innovation throughout the business and at different levels. And there's something, instead of being disruptive innovation, there's incremental innovation. And those companies that grow and continue to grow and are successful are both incrementally innovating all the time, whilst simultaneously looking for that disruptive play if it exists and if it makes strategic sense, and being really careful about when they pull the trigger on a disruptive play. But there's incremental innovation. So probably we should think about what exactly does that mean? What does innovation mean at that level? And I think the best single statement to really encapsulate that is it means doing something different to the way we did it yesterday. Too often I frequently coach and consult for companies, and too often their biggest issue is they just cannot get out of the headspace of this is the way we've always done it. So we want to innovate in order to be successful. So if we know that innovation is really key to growth, and we know what growth is, why aren't all companies enjoying sensational growth? And that's really what the first part of this talk is going to focus on, that question. And we're going to look through 5 key points that are the most common issues that I see in helping small and large enterprises. And typically they're around the people decisions, they're about decision making. So let's kick off and look at the first one. Prioritize poorly. If there's a business and a product manager, if in our product decisions we're prioritizing poorly, what does that mean? It means we're not making the best decisions that are going to create the most value and do all those things you talked about at the beginning. One gentleman gave a very comprehensive, really good statement. I wish I could remember it, but I can't now. And that we're not doing achieving that good stuff. We're unable to please the customer, find the right market fit, and deliver because we're prioritizing poorly. And there's a lot of reasons why we might prioritize poorly that we'll come on to. But I wanted to just touch first on thinking about the most common way of prioritizing that I see. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's perfectly fine. But it's often done poorly. And that's normally the case where you think about, as a product manager, you think about the value to your business and the customer. So the customer has this problem, we want to fix it. We have an idea of how we might fix it. It might be worth this amount to the customer. It's really valuable to them. Or it might be that we can sell it for this amount and generate all this new income. And we think it's going to cost us this another amount. That's another guess. And that amount is often thought of as effort rather than cost in cross-functional product teams. And when we prioritize, we often look at those two things and do the sort of 2x2 grid thing and go, well, which things can we do quickly? Like, what can we do cheaply that's going to have a high value impact? In other words, we do an ROI analysis. We might not call it that, but that's what we're doing. We're doing a return on investment analysis. And that on its own, I can't disagree with. Maybe sometimes we need to prioritize the strategic win and the longer picture more, because often that kind of approach will fail to deliver on a bigger strategic plan for a much bigger picture win. But assuming we're balancing that properly, there's nothing wrong with that approach. Where it fails is the assumption making. We make enormous assumptions over what the value to the customer is, over what the value to the business is, and even bigger ones over the cost and effort of creating or building the particular feature or solution. And that becomes a real problem. And when I look at teams that are doing this, they're typically teams that know really well, they know really well how to do product. They know they should talk to their customers on a regular basis. They know they should observe their customers using their products. They know they should take these ideas they have and validate and experiment and try and understand and try and prove themselves wrong. But they don't do any of those things. They sit in a room, possibly with a hippo, a highest paid person, directing what to do. Not always, though. I've seen it where there's no hippo there at all. But they sit in a room and make some enormous assumptions about the customer base and then make a decision on it. Which means that ROI investment, that ROI analysis is based off the value, how good that is, how confident we are that that's a good prioritization process, is 100% based on how good our assumption is. And if our assumptions aren't good, we prioritize poorly. Hopefully that makes sense. If there are any questions, shout them out now before I move on to the next point. Is there anybody typing questions?
We haven't had any questions through yet.
Great, no problem. They always can ask later. It's really hard for the audience, just to let you know, I can't see the question screen. So apologies if I keep having to ask. I just don't want to miss out. So let's have a little look at the video. It is it's your evening time, so maybe watch something. So hopefully you all just saw that video play well. And hopefully what you saw was this herd of cows moving from one field to another. And every single cow jumps over that white line. Which is bizarre. There's nothing wrong with the white line. There's no hole in it. It's not booby trapped. They can walk across it. It's not going to harm them. But every single cow jumped over it, one by one. And we do this in business all the time. We call it collection belief. We sit in those meetings making those assumptions, and one person, like the cow at the front, makes a loud statement, is confident when they make it, sounds good to us, and we decide that there's no need to, we might as well agree with it. In fact, we don't just decide we'll agree with it, we're often quite worried about disagreeing with it. Often the company cultures makes it hard for me to disagree without evidence. Makes it just a battle of opinions. And if I do that, I'm just an annoying person in the room. So not only am I put off to actually disagree because of the social element of work operates and how certain cultures behave, but I also do it because of this psychological thing called collection belief, where once one or two other people in the room are nodding and agreeing, suddenly I nod and agree as well. And it's really easy for me to think this is a good thing at that very split second. And that happens all the time. I've sat in C-suite meetings and watched that happen, walk out of the meeting, get in an elevator, and somebody from the meeting go, I disagree with that completely. Yet in the meeting, they were nodding furiously. It's a common problem. And this helps cement those assumptions that we talked about just in prioritizing. It helps us, encourages us to cement an assumption. We feel good about it, and the people are agreeing, and then the room is all agreeing without any evidence, and we're talking ourselves into a hyped up place. We're drinking our own Kool-Aid, and it's based on nothing. So we need to be really aware as product managers that this is going on, and we need to come up with strategies in your companies, in those meetings you might be running. We need to come up with strategies of how we break it down. How do we stop that? And then obviously one of the most common ones, but it's the most painful because it's the most time consuming for the product manager. One of the most easiest ways for the product manager is to have the discussion with lots of people one-to-one. So we can't have collection belief and bring it all together to everybody at a later point once we've managed to get people's opinions singularly. But hopefully you recognize that, and by recognizing it, we can start thinking about how we stop it. Similar, but nuanced, is confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is something, I said earlier about validating experiments. And that's like the worst product management phrase ever. I hate it. Unfortunately, I haven't got a better one. And the reason I hate it is we set out, even if we're good, even if we've designed an experiment and we've been really careful, we regularly will set out to try and confirm that we are correct. When what we should be doing is going out there, looking for evidence and proof that we're wrong. Confirming we're right, apart from making us feel good, is way less valuable because the likelihood that we are right is actually probably quite low. I'd much rather find out I'm wrong sooner and quicker and cheaper so I can learn and iterate and move on quicker instead of being later. But we don't. We talk about validation experiments. We read about validation experiments. We try and we look at evidence and we interpret statistics to find trends and to find figures that back up that we're correct, rather than going out of our way to do the exact opposite and look hard in those numbers for things that might tell us we're wrong. So it's really important when we think about our assumptions that we're using to make ROI decisions, and if we have done the sensible thing and where the investment's high, and we've gone and done some research or some customer validation to understand that problem the customer's problem in more detail, hopefully if we do it well, we'll avoid confirmation bias and really try not to do that. And one of the best things, I think, and it's a tiny little change, but I've helped lots of teams do this, and it sounds very trivial, but it has a huge impact, is when designing experiments to validate a hypothesis. First of all, make sure that people are writing a hypothesis that are falsifiable. So a good hypothesis is written in a way that can be falsified. And then making sure when we design our experiment of how we might test that, whether that be a customer interview or a prototype or some 404 experiment or Wizard of Oz or concierge, whatever type you're doing, when we design it, I so often see people saying my success criteria is X. I will be successful. Our experiments, we will pass, we're good, if we achieve, 5% of customers say blah, or whatever it is, whatever the numbers are. And if we change that, it's very small, change that to, it's not, instead of writing down our success criteria, we write down our failure criteria, we immediately start changing the confirmation bias discussion. It means when we look to design an experiment and we have a failure criteria, it means we've had to think about, well, what does it have to be for us not to do this thing? And that changes the conversation and framing. And it also changes the results. I've seen bunches of experiments of teams really working hard to experiment, and it's all a waste of time, because what they fall into a trap of doing is they fall into a trap of, they see the success criteria as 10%, and then it comes in at 8%. And they go, well, it was only 2% less, and 8%, that's still a reasonably big number in this particular thing we're talking about. We should go ahead and do this thing anyway. This confirms it. And that happens all the time, where if we talk about the failure criteria, that conversation for some reason just does not take place. We don't end up with this, well, it's still a big number. We instead go, no, it failed. And then do the sensible thing and start learning why, and iterate and improve. And that's what drives innovation. That's going to be proper innovation, solving customers' problems. Right, on to number 4 already. Status quo bias. And that has nothing to do with the band. Thank God. Status quo bias. This is that simple thing of where you've heard people say, it's the way we've always done it. What, we just do it because we've always done it that way. And I definitely have done this. I've worked in businesses and felt like, I'm not doing this. We do things differently. We're always trying to reinvent. We're trying to improve, continuously improve, really trying hard. But there are still a bunch of things that we just end up doing. We don't even think about why we're doing it that way. It's just because that's the way we've been doing it. So it's really important to start challenging yourself and your teams, if you're product leaders, challenging yourself to, why are we doing it this way? Is this really the right way to go about this? And I think the biggest thing to challenge isn't necessarily conclusions and why you've got certain features, that sort of thing. Instead, it's challenge your process. It's when processes get stuck in the status quo space, that's when we really struggle to improve. It's challenging the processes. Why do you operate in this way? Why do you prioritize this way? What do we do to improve our confidence? Why do we make the decision this way? Why do we prototype this way, etc., etc.? Think about the process. And if you're constantly improving the process, then we get to a better place. And if you're in cross-functional teams, this is what retrospectives should be doing. Unfortunately, too many retrospectives are just a psychological counseling for the people in the team to have a good moan about things. And that's needed. I appreciate that. But great retrospectives are where the team identify problems and fix their processes, improve their processes. So when they have those complaints, they're positives. They're like, great, we know this thing doesn't work well. We hate the way we do this. Let's fix it and change our process. And that's a far more positive attitude for the team. But most importantly, it's a far better outcome for the business, because you can continuously improving the process. Product people should be process obsessed. second to customers. Obviously, customers are always first. I mentioned output and outcome just very briefly. I just said outcomes, and I was really careful not to say output by mistake. Output-driven leadership kills all innovation. Even if everything else is good, it kills innovation straight. We're going to talk about this a bit more later to really explain it. But hopefully everybody has heard the idea of outcome versus outcomes. But if not, outputs is where we're focused on deliverables. We're focused on the amount of features we built this week, or the amount of code we committed, or some metric that shows that we're in sort of factory mode being productive. Outcomes are focused on measurable, definable benefits for the customer and for the business. So if I was outcome focused, somebody talked about NPS earlier as a growth metric, which is really interesting. Outcome would be, we're going to work really hard in this next 6 weeks to get our NPS up by 2 percentage points. And we're going to do whatever we have to do that. The output, we're not committing to an output, we're committing to an outcome. So we're not committing to, we need to build feature X because it will do this thing, because we don't really know if feature X will do that thing. Instead, we're committing to the outcome. And when we commit to outcomes, it gives us permission to fail and to get rid of those bad ideas quicker. It gives us permission to not worry about the confirmation and bias, and to really look for failure so we can move on quicker. Because we know it's pointless as wasting our time and effort on an output that isn't going to impact our outcome. So we'll talk about this a little bit later, because it deserves it, and it's I think it's worth describing in more detail the opposite. We're exactly describing what outcome leadership looks like.
Dave, we've just had a question come through from Sam, and he asks, if you're speaking with different users and customers every day, what are the dangers to look out for with false feedback? And is the only way to overcome this based on A/B testing or prototyping?
Great. Okay, Sam, that's a really good question. Thank you. I'm guessing by the way you asked the question that you possibly are B2C, given lots of different types of customers. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think the way to the key thing is to have high cadence of customer interaction, and for that interaction to be meaningful and purposeful, so that you're trying to you're talking to customers for two different reasons: either to validate, or more importantly, invalidate your assumptions, your hypotheses, or you're talking to customers exploratively to generate ideas and just learn more stuff and try and spot some new opportunities. And they're very different conversations. They might happen in the same meeting. Quite often they do. It's efficient and effective, but they're different conversations. So how would you, to get more accurate, I think what you're asking there is, how do I get more accurate feedback so I can trust it more? And that's going to be down to the kind of experiment you do and the point you are in the journey of your idea, of your solution to the problem, and your understanding of the problem evolving. So customer interviews are the cheapest and easiest thing for us to do, and they're reasonably accurate feedback. However, we might not see trends. You might, like you're mentioning, see things that get differing feedback. And that's okay if it's generative. But if we're trying to invalidate our ideas, then we need to think about structuring that conversation more. And a prototype helps you structure that conversation more. If the experiment designed well around a prototype will do that. Alternatively, you could look at a fast, low fidelity prototype is only a little bit more expensive than a customer interview, and obviously involves a customer interview. The next stage up, when you're talking about, you could do a 404 test, a smoke test, if you're able to do something like that. That's more accurate because the customer is in the real world environment, and the more close your experiment is to their real world context, the more accurate the feedback will be. And then obviously, eventually, you mentioned A/B tests. That's like the far end of the scale if we look at accuracy of experimentation versus cost of experimentation. It's the most accurate, but it's also the most expensive. And unfortunately, it's not viable for many problems. It depends on your business. In B2C world, it can often be viable to do a A/B test because you often will have a large volume of traffic, a large volume of users. In B2B world, there's often nowhere near enough users to have any A/B test that's scientifically significant, where you've got statistical significance in the result. You would have to be leaving the test running for like 12 months to get any significance. And if you can't get significance out of the test, there's no point doing it in the first place. So people in B2B land quite often have, or B2C businesses that are young and don't have large volumes, or super premium or something and don't have large volumes, they have to rely on trying other alternative types of experimentation. Hopefully that answered the question.
Awesome. Cheers, Dave. We have another question come through from Matt. And this one is, what are some of the best ways that you found to share qualitative feedback from your customer with other teams to help product decisions?
Fantastic question, Matt. Love it. We have an entire module on the course in our business on this. It's an awesome topic. And something that people just don't do very well so often. It's hard. But there's so many quick wins. So maybe I'll just give you a couple of quick wins where I've seen this work really well. For internal sharing of that knowledge, first of all, every product team I've ever led in every business I've been involved with, and some have been large product team, 70 odd engineers, 20 odd product managers, size teams. We've always had a day every fortnight we call Share and Learn. And in Share and Learn, it's your responsibility as a product person to share with everybody else in the business on a 45-minute meeting or webinar call type setup. It's your responsibility to give them the highlights of what you learned this last fortnight. Doesn't work for all businesses because not all businesses have anything to share every fortnight because they haven't yet got established into a high velocity of learning. But as you start to get better at it, I would recommend doing that. For sharing snippets and wanting to influence and help stakeholders understand the customer's problems more, by far the best way, if you've got qualitative data, is to cut the video down. So quite often we would do video interviews over Zoom or over one of the mobile apps that does it. And we would always create a highlight reel from it. So we might have done 8 hours of interviews, but we create a 30-second highlight reel. And that 30 seconds would get shared with the exec team, with the C-suite, with anybody we could possibly get in front of who it mattered to. And that's because quite often the higher up in leadership the stakeholder is, the more abstracted they are from the customer. And the voice of the customer is incredibly powerful to them. Really powerful to hear that in a C-suite meeting, to hear customers' voices and see them talking about your products in a really short, consumable reel. Really helps get your message across. And then it's not you guys, it's not the product manager's opinion anymore. It's out there as closer to fact. And that takes very little effort. I'm a Mac user, so I just have iMovie, but I'm sure Windows has something else, Movie Maker or something. It takes very little effort just to grab a few snippets of video and put them in one reel. It hasn't got to be beautifully produced. It doesn't need fancy animation at the beginning and end. It just needs nice and authentic, raw and ready. And if you can't do that, if that's beyond you, or your computer can't hack it or whatever it is, then just write down some of the words, exactly as they're said, and distribute that instead. Hopefully that helped.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Dave. We actually have a couple more questions that have come through now. Do you want to field them now?
Yeah, let's do them. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so from Nilu, they ask, how do we deal with what users want when most of the time they don't know if they need a particular feature in that product?
Okay, that's an interesting question. I think I would probably reframe the thinking a little there. Quite often, I would agree that users might not know what they want, and the solutions they suggest are quite often, sometimes they're inspiring, but they're not always the right thing for us to build. And I think the problem with that, especially if it's coming through sales, it's often really not the best data at all. I would encourage you to try and think deeper and do more empathetic research with the customer to really understand what their problem is. Quite often, because when they tell you their solution, you don't really understand what the problem is, and you're having to solve. If they tell you what I want, I want this new, I want a button to hit print. You don't really know what their problem is. You have no idea what they're actually trying to achieve, and that's where it becomes much more interesting. So I'd encourage you to get beyond the symptoms of their problems and beyond the potential solutions they've come up with, and dig into the actual underlying causes. And when you do that, then you can start to innovate. And the innovation might be a customer's idea, it might be something they've suggested, totally. But it needs to be bound to the actual underlying problem so that you know it's valid and you understand the problem space you're trying to solve. Hopefully that helps. Was there another question?
Awesome. Yeah, there's another question here from Keith, which is, moving a team to be outcome, not output focused, can require a real cultural change outside of the product team too. Do you have suggestions on ways to do this and how to sell the approach to stakeholders?
I'm going to pass on that question, and let us see. Some slides later on will help with this. The short answer is that there isn't. I don't think there is a like quick win. Couple of tips. We can do this. It is hard work. It does require salesmanship up the chain. It does often. I've seen it work very well when you've got external people helping you with the salesmanship. It gets rid of some of the internal bias. It's been incredibly frustrating personally, as working inside a company and not your message not being heard, but then somebody comes in from externally saying exactly the same thing, and suddenly everybody wants to do it. But it helps you get there quicker often. But let's talk about that a little bit later on, if that's okay. Sorry about that, because we've got some pictures on that later. Is that okay?
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. Yeah, that's all the questions we've had so far.
Thanks, everybody, for asking questions. Keep them coming. It makes it far more interesting than me just broadcasting. So how do we improve our odds to be able to build successful products? The two things I'm going to suggest and briefly go through is outcome-driven leadership and lean evidence-based decisions. I'm going to do the lean evidence-based decisions first. So I want to talk about that number in that red circle, 57. And I promise it has nothing to do with Heinz. 57 years ago, a chap called Everett Rogers, who was a sociologist, wrote The Theory of Diffusion. And we should care about this as product people. We probably don't even know who he is normally. But the theory of diffusion was the first time the product adoption curve was identified. And if you're not familiar with that curve, this is the typical curve where we see early adopters who buy that product first. We see the early majority. Eventually, they start buying it. We see the late majority. And then finally, we see the laggards, the people that really, they're forced onto it because they have to. And Everett identified this in a very low-tech space. Well, it wasn't at the time. It is now. He identified it in the engine, the combustion engine, replacing horses in farming. And it was that pattern. And if you look at more recently, if we think of mobile phone or smartphones, you'll see exactly the same transition. Where originally many people didn't really understand what an iPhone was and why you would need one, and the early tech adopters like me were obsessed with it and bought it straight away, and then bought Android phones and all the rest. But eventually, suddenly everyone got one, until now my mother-in-law has got one, which only happened last week, by the way. So they're a final person onto the smartphone journey. And that took a couple of, maybe a decade in total. Often our adoption is shorter in tech than that, but it's a good example. And that curve's pretty important. And I'm going to draw it in a different way to normal, because I want to think about it slightly differently. I want to think about the fact that our number of active customers in total and time across the x-axis. And the stages we go through is we create, we launch, and we look for adoption. Our creation phase is the phase that loads of product management training is about, loads of product management books and loads of talks. And we all get very excited about it. And that's where we're thinking about new product development and discovery for new product development. Interestingly, not that many people do new product development, even though we talk about it so much. And that's no surprise when you think of the fact there's lots of established products. So we have the create phase. The launch phase is getting it out the door, and that early adopter phase, the first few people using it, the Apple fanboys buying the Apple Watch. That's the launch phase. The adoption phase is when we're starting to see the early market see it. And if we think about that slightly differently, really we could think about it as the awareness phase, the first use phase, and the repeat use phase. And that might fit better, especially to you guys thinking about MAUs and subscribers, etc. Awareness, first use, repeat. And we've known about this for a long time now. This isn't new. But for some reason, we have these products that don't follow this big curve. Instead, they follow this blue curve. And they have limited growth. And we've known about this for a long time. In 1991, Geoffrey Moore wrote the book, Crossing the Chasm. If you haven't read it, you really should. It's a fantastic book. And he really describes the challenge as for new product development, the challenge of how we get from the early adopters to early mainstream. And the point that we can believe we're doing really well, but they're early adopters. They'll always jump on the bandwagon. And without solving the problem for early mainstream, we don't ever get up that curve. We get stuck in this limited growth. And it's not just us who get stuck as mere mortal product managers. Segway, which I'm sure you've all heard of, those little two-wheel things that a president fell off even though you weren't supposed to be able to fall off them. The Segway was a complete disaster as an organization, as a business. They got great startup funding. They had a target of 100,000 forecasted sales, really sure they would do it. But instead, they sold 6,000 in the first year and ended up collapsing the company and reshaping it completely. And Segway had on their board supporting them Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos. Now, those two people aren't beginners, nor was the founders. They were not beginners, but they still fell foul of being able to cross that chasm and have many, many products. There's a great website, I think it's called the Graveyard of Google, something like that. And it has all the Google products that have been canned. And there's a lot of them. And they're a similar story. They can't get past over the chasm. So we've known about that problem for a long while now, for what, 20 plus years, 29 years. But we're still not able to beat it. We're still falling foul of it. And that's because, in my opinion, one reason, there's many reasons, but one massive reason is the bias that we talked about earlier. We get stuck with that bias in our decision making. And it's not just the biases we talked about earlier. A chap called Daniel Kahneman won a Nobel Prize about 18 years ago. And he wrote specifically because he clarified and identified something called the gain and losses. And it's been popularized more recently in the chimp paradox book. So you might have seen that, you might have read that. And what that research is all about is loss aversion. And loss aversion is the fact that we do not, as human beings, make rational decisions. We like to pretend we do, but we don't, according to Daniel and the chimp paradox. Instead, we make decisions based on perceived value. And because of our reptilian brain, hardwired prehistorically for survival, we view loss, we perceive loss, apparently it's 10 times more than we perceive gain. So if you lost you've lost £10 on the way home, you would need to gain £100 to have the same equivalent perceived value. Your motivation to do something to not lose out and not lose money or lose anything is far, far bigger than your motivation to gain. And you see this in organizations a lot. So many organizations I've worked with, big investments to save money and cut costs, but not big investments to make bigger money. It's the same thing. It's this loss aversion. The same thing as the sunken cost fallacy, when we've put loads of money into a product and we're way down a feature, way down a road, and we probably know in our hearts that it's the wrong road, but we've gone so far now, we might as well carry on, even though it's going to end up in tears. We still carry on, and that's the same thing. It's all down to loss aversion. And it's important that we recognize that loss aversion, because that's at the heart of what makes these biased decisions. When Segway made various decisions to continue investing, even though sales were going poorly, they knew they were going down that blue line. And what we do, that status quo bias sinks in, and we end up doing that thing that Einstein talks about. We carry on doing the same thing, but somehow expect a different result. And as product managers, we have to find a way, as product managers, we have to find a way to identify that, make it clear to everyone, and force different decisions. That's not easy though, because it forces not only our executives and leaders doubling down on the wrong things, so are our customers. Our customers are doubling down on the wrong things too. They're biased. So how do we fix that? We fix that with a test and learn approach, or what is more commonly described as lean. But that's hard for some for some enterprises to get behind. So test and learn is more palatable, and they're used to it with marketing. We have to have a test and learn, and the tighter those cycles are, the closer together and the more of them there are, the more chance we have of being successful. And that's what this squiggly line is showing. We will go up and down constantly, but if we test and learn properly and we try and avoid the bias with the evidence, we will then be able to drive that journey upwards, assuming the problem space actually exists, of course, and we can have a real problem to solve. So that's one of the two things we talked about, trying to really focus on a lean experimental approach. The other was outcome-driven leadership. So let's quickly just explain that so everyone understands and is comfy. There's a few things here we should quickly talk about. There's some numbers at the bottom, 19 and 20. That's just reminding us the Harvard Business Review reckons that 19 out of 20 new products fail. So it's really, probability is against us. We have leadership, and we have this cross-functional product dev team, and over the other side we have this circle, and it says problem space. And if you can read it, you might not be able to. It says thousands of target customers inside that problem space. That's what the little black dots are. Those are customers. And unfortunately, this is what regularly happens. Leadership have an idea that we should build some solution. The product dev team go and build said solution because that's what they've been told to do. And they do their best, and they prioritize based on the cost of each feature, etc., like we talked about. And they deliver the new .com. But it misses the problem. As we see here, this cloud of .com is not inside the problem space. It's outside of the problem space. And this is all coming from the fact that we've gambled with the idea very early on. I'm blaming leadership here, but it's not always. It can be the product team. But we've gambled with the idea early on instead of experimenting with the idea. And that ends up with customers. Now, you might sell a load of this .com to start with, because you might have really good sales and marketing people. But really good sales and marketing people will very rarely be able to keep selling the same thing to the same customer if it's not good enough or fixes the wrong problem. So even if we do make some early sales, we'll have low retention and we'll have super low adoption. The alternative approach is that leadership leads with the outcome they want. The outcome is carefully worded to not dictate the solution, but the business or customer outcome they feel is important, which is their prerogative. The product team, instead of going and building that thing, because they can't, because they haven't been told what to build now, they've been told what outcome to achieve. That empowers the product team and gives them some autonomy, and they can test and learn lots of ideas, and they can test and learn very quickly. And that allows innovation, because we've tried lots of things until we find things that work properly. And each time we go around that cycle of experiment, measure, learn, each time we go around it, we're learning. So we're getting more and more, we're building up residual value and asset as an organization about our customers' problems in order to build solutions quicker for them. This time when we deliver the .com, it's not in some cloud that nobody knows, outside of what no one can see. This time it's right in the middle of the problem space. And obviously the customer is very happy and we have high growth. Hopefully that answers, I think it was Matt's question earlier. I can't remember the gentleman's name, but hopefully that helps a little bit. And as an organization, to unlearn how the blue line and learn how to do this properly is hard. It takes leadership needs some help, because leadership needs somebody to point out to them, stop solutionizing. And that can be hard to do in the culture up the chain. It needs some extra buy-in, and that's where support comes in at leadership level. That's where product consultants can help you at that level, or bring in new leadership. So I've got one last thing to share, and I'm going to flip through it really quickly because I'm looking at the clock. I'm going to flip through all of this and this. To be honest, this is always here in case I talk too fast and need something to pad it out with. But the bit at the end is important. We have something called the assessment toolkit, right to left, and it lets you, as a product manager, answer 22 simple questions. You don't have to type a single letter. It's in those questions. It's just well, you have to type your name at the beginning, but it's just a click on a number, 1 to 5, how well you rate yourself against these things. And at the end of it, we then crunch that data and send you a report to give you clarity on your competencies in regard to operating as a lean product manager. And it lets you highlight where your strengths are and where some weaknesses are, so that you can help identify and look to improve. And the aim being that you're then able to use the same learn and iterate approach for yourself and for your teams and for your own career, and learn and iterate yourself, allowing you to identify where the gaps are, come up with a target condition, and then do things to try and improve it, and then review it and carry on, which is the improvement cycle. So if you fancy doing that, I'll go back to the URL. Oh no, I've hit back too much. It was toolkit.right-to-left.co.uk. I think we might be good for time. And that brings me to the end, unless there's any more questions.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Dave. And what we can do is when we share out a write-up summary of the talk onto LinkedIn, we can include links like the toolkit
great.
here as well, so everyone can access that. We don't have any questions right now popping up, but if we give folks just a couple of minutes, I think there's a slight delay on that too. Thanks for the talk. It was absolutely fantastic, and it really really hit home with some of the kind of different struggles and things that I'm definitely going through. And I think one question I had was around sort of this idea of reframing to invalidate, and I really liked this concept of what are the failure metrics as opposed to success metrics. I just wondered if you had any tips on how you might, because I've felt myself have that bias in customer interviews and in prototype tests, like how you might reframe those to invalidate as opposed to validate.
I think if I understand the question, it's about how you ask the question better. How do you change the framing of the question? In other words, how do you make, and the key there is to stop asking leading questions and not to never to ask a closed question, always to ask an open exploratory question, hoping that the designed for the user to naturally give you answers in the space you're hoping to hear them, but not designed in order to give the answers you want to hear. So by forcing them always to be open questions, it becomes harder to have such confirmation. It'd be harder to have to design it with the bias. But I would always think about, if I'm wrong, I would always think about, if our assumption is, if my hypothesis is wrong, what do I have to ask to find that out? What areas might it be? You know, if I want to find out if a user, if I want to find out if a user wants to, if a user is interested in using a particular feature, say some email feature of the product. We don't support email today, but we'd like to support email in whatever this product is. What's the problem that's solving? And the hypothesis should be written, a good written hypothesis, and maybe it's the focus is on the hypothesis. If you write the hypothesis around the problem space, not about your solution. So your hypothesis shouldn't be, we believe email will fix our customer's problem.
Yeah.
It should be about understanding the problem. And if you can write that hypothesis so it's falsifiable and really put some effort into writing that hypothesis, then the questions should all be bound to the hypothesis. And if your hypothesis is truly falsifiable, your questions won't have bias built in.
Fantastic. That's great. No, thanks very much for that, Dave. Awesome. It doesn't look like we've had any other questions come through. So I think definitely would have cleared up any sort of questions going through. But yeah, thanks again for the talk. That was absolutely fantastic. And so just closing out from our side here, what we want to do is just introduce our talk next time. So we'll be meeting virtually again next month. And next month, our speaker, Randy Silva, will be talking to remote product discovery. So that is up live on the meetup page, as well as the Mind the Product event page as well.
You should definitely tune into that. Me and Randy did a lecture not long ago to London Business School to a bunch of MBA students, and he's a great speaker. And I know this talk he's going to do, and you should definitely tune in. I think he's brought out a book as well about product management in COVID. So if you can get hold of that, I would. Randy's awesome.
Yeah. The book was just released in the last week, I think, and it's that's one we'll share in our write-up as well, because that is so relevant at the moment, and I think remote product discovery really will be as well. So that will be towards the end of June. So we'll send out sort of announcements after this. Also, Janice should have somewhere hopefully posted the sign-in sheet just to let us know that you attended. That would be awesome as well. And kind of lastly, closing off, as I mentioned at the start, ProductTank Birmingham, we're very much by product people and for product people. So please do participate and get in touch. Continue to attend our virtual events, having great conversation and engagement coming through the chat as well. If you'd like to speak, please do get in touch. If you've got a story that you really want to share with the community, that would be great. And continue to participate, follow us on Twitter, and also join our LinkedIn group as well. I'm just checking the comments here because I'm not sure if we've just had another question come through. Okay, no, it's perfect. It was just people saying thanks for the session, amazing session, great talk, and things going through there. So that's awesome. Cool. Okay, that's everything from our side. So thanks again, Dave, so much for jumping on this evening. And yeah, we look forward to inviting you to real life ProductTank Birmingham meetup for some beers and more product discussions in the future.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.